Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be tackling a topic that I think is on everyone's minds these days. The global economy.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can feel really huge and complex.
Right.
So it's great to have a guide to help us make sense of it all. And for this deep dive, we're turning to the work of Noam Chomsky.
Specifically, his book, The Prosperous Few and the Restless Many.
Yeah, that's the one.
So really what we're trying to understand here is this. How is power shifting on a global scale?
And maybe even more importantly, what does that mean for us?
Exactly. For everyday people.
Right. So Chomsky starts by making this observation about growing poverty and how it's becoming more and more visible.
Even in places that are considered affluent.
Exactly, like right in his own backyard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which, you wouldn't necessarily think of as a place where poverty is front and center.
True.
But he's noticing it more and more, and it leads him to this idea of internal third worldization.
Okay. I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it. What does it actually mean?
So basically, he's saying that the United States is starting to exhibit a lot of the same characteristics that we typically associate with developing nations.
So like what kinds of characteristics?
Well, think about things like stagnant wages, people working harder and harder, but not really seeing their incomes grow.
Yep.
Rising poverty levels, crumbling infrastructure.
Oh, yeah, the roads, the bridges, all that.
Exactly. All those things that we kind of take for granted as part of, a functioning society.
Right.
But they're starting to decay, and it's impacting our quality of life.
Yeah, for sure. And those are definitely things that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Absolutely.
But how does Chomsky connect this trend back to globalization? Like, what's the link there?
Well, he sees globalization as a key driver of this because it's enabled corporations to shift production to countries with lower labor costs and weaker regulations.
Right. So it's cheaper to do business elsewhere.
Exactly. And he uses the example of General Motors.
Oh, interesting.
So they shut down a bunch of factories in North America.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
But then they opened this really high-tech facility in East Germany where wages are significantly lower.
Wow.
So you have this kind of strange situation where the U.S., as a geographic entity, might be experiencing decline.
Okay.
But then U.S.-based corporations, many of which are now transnational.
Right. They're not even really tied to one country anymore.
Exactly. They're flourishing elsewhere. So it really makes you question what America even means in this new globalized context.
That is a good question.
Yeah, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yep.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about something that's always a hot topic, the free market.
Ah, yeah, everyone's got an opinion on that one.
For sure, and Chomsky, drawing on the work of these World Bank economists, Daly and Goodland, he challenges some of the traditional ideas about the free market.
It's very good.
He brings up this really interesting analogy that they use to describe the role of corporations.
Okay.
They say that corporations have gotten so big that they're like islands approaching the scale of the sea.
Whoa, that's kind of a mind-blowing image.
Right, like these giant entities that are disrupting the balance of the whole system.
Yeah, they're not little ships anymore. They're practically continents.
Exactly. And what they're getting at is that these massive corporations have accumulated so much power that they're no longer playing by the rules of a traditional free market.
So it's like the game is rigged in their favor.
In a way, yeah. And it's not just economic power either.
Oh, I bet they've got their fingers in the political pie, too.
You bet they do. Chomsky talks about this de facto world government that's emerging through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and trade agreements like NAFTA and JT.
Those big international agreements.
Yeah. And the problem is that these entities are making decisions that impact all of our lives.
Of course.
But they're often doing it outside of democratic processes.
So we don't really have a say in what they're doing.
Not as much as we should. It creates what's called a democratic deficit.
Meaning?
Meaning there's a gap between the people making the decisions and our ability as citizens to influence those decisions.
So we're kind of left out in the cold.
Yeah, a lot of people feel that way, like they're powerless.
Powerless and disconnected from the forces that are shaping their lives.
Exactly. And now I want to bring in another player that you might not expect.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Who is it?
The Pentagon.
The Pentagon. What does the military have to do with the global economy?
Well, Chomsky makes this really interesting argument.
Okay.
He says that beyond its military role, the Pentagon system has actually functioned as a kind of disguised industrial policy for the United States.
Wow, I've never thought of it that way before. Explain that a little more.
So basically he's saying that the Pentagon has provided all these subsidies,
Okay.
funded research and development, and acted as a guaranteed market.
A guaranteed customer.
Exactly, for major corporations.
I see.
Especially those in the defense industry.
So they've been propping up certain sectors of the economy.
In a way, yes. And it's been going on for a long time.
But Chomsky seems to be suggesting that this system isn't really sustainable anymore.
Right. He points out that after the end of the Cold War, it became harder to justify these massive military budgets.
Yeah, without a clear enemy, it's a tough sell.
Exactly. And the industries that are emerging now, like biotech and genetic engineering, they don't really fit neatly under the Pentagon's umbrella.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Precisely. And you can see this difference in approach if you compare, say, the Reagan-Bush years, which were very ideologically driven, pro-market, to Clinton's approach. Well, he was more willing to acknowledge that the government might need to play a role in the economy.
So there's this tension between those who believe the government should stay out of it completely and those who think it needs to intervene in some way.
Right. And for those who are advocating for a more open industrial policy, one that's not hidden within the Pentagon system, there are all these obstacles.
Like what?
Well, you've got the massive national debt.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Cultural resistance to government involvement in the private sector.
People get worried about the government getting too big.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the power of the corporate lobbies.
Right. They're not going to give up their influence easily?
Not at all. But here's the thing that Chomsky points out. Even if you believe in limited government, if you neglect things like social spending and infrastructure, it ultimately harms everyone, even the wealthy.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. If you have a society where education is underfunded, healthcare is a mess, and the roads and bridges are falling apart, it creates all these ripple effects.
Right. Companies can't find skilled workers. Yeah. The overall quality of life declines. And even the wealthy lose access to this stable and prosperous environment.
It's like shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, and everyone around you.
Okay, so let's get a little more specific here.
Okay, sure.
I want to talk about some concrete examples of how these global forces are playing out.
Sounds good.
Have you ever heard of NAFTA and GATT?
Of course. Those are those big trade agreements.
Right. But to be honest, I don't really understand all the ins and outs of them.
Well, they're often presented as promoting free trade. Global competitiveness.
Sounds good on the surface.
Right. It all sounds very positive.
Yeah, a level playing field for everyone.
But Chomsky argues that the reality is a lot more complicated than that.
Okay, how so?
Well, he suggests that these agreements can actually lead to what's called a race to the bottom.
A race to the bottom? What does that even mean?
Basically, it means that corporations, in their quest for the highest profits,
will seek out the lowest labor costs, the weakest environmental regulations. The fewest worker protections.
So it's not about lifting everyone up.
No, not really.
It's about seeing who can exploit the most.
That's a pretty harsh way to put it, but yeah, that's one way to look at it.
And this isn't just some theoretical concern.
No, it has real consequences for workers.
Of course.
Chomsky talks about the situation in Mexican maquiladoras.
Those are the factories along the U.S.-Mexico border, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And workers there often face really terrible conditions.
Low wages.
Yeah, low wages, unsafe working conditions, environmental pollution.
It's like the dark side of globalization.
It is. And what's even more troubling is the lack of transparency surrounding these agreements. Chomsky highlights how NAFTA, for example, was negotiated in secret.
Really?
Yeah, it was even kept from the Labor Advisory Committee.
Wow.
Which raises serious questions about who these agreements are really serving.
It sounds like corporate interests are being put ahead of the well-being of workers and the environment.
That's a valid concern. And on that note, there's another aspect of these agreements that Chomsky finds particularly worrying.
Okay, tell me more.
The emphasis on intellectual property rights.
Oh, especially within GPT.
Yeah, exactly.
I've heard about that.
And his argument is that these provisions could actually end up restricting access to essential technologies.
Especially for developing nations.
Right.
So instead of helping everyone progress, it's actually creating barriers.
Yeah. Think about something like affordable medications. Strengthening intellectual property rights could make it harder for people in developing countries to access those life-saving drugs while benefiting large multinational pharmaceutical companies.
So it's like this double whammy.
It is.
It raises all these ethical questions about who benefits from these agreements and who pays the price.
You got it.
It's like what they say, the devil is in the details.
Yeah, you really have to look beyond the surface.
Because what sounds good in theory can have very different consequences in the real world.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to another area where these global forces are playing a big role.
Okay, sure.
Food politics.
Yes, everyone's got to eat.
Right. This is something that affects every single person on the planet.
It does, and Chomsky brings up this really disturbing trend.
Okay.
He argues that policies implemented by the IMF and the World Bank are often pressuring developing nations to prioritize exports.
So things like coffee, beef.
Yeah, those kinds of cash crops.
Okay.
At the expense of producing food for their own populations.
Wait, so they're being encouraged to grow food for other countries while their own people are going hungry.
It's a tragic irony.
It is. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And it often is.
Are there any real-world examples of this happening?
Absolutely. Chomsky uses the example of Bolivia's economic miracle.
Economic miracle.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good thing.
Well, on the surface, yeah.
Okay, but there's got to be a catch.
There is. So Bolivia managed to stabilize its economy through increased exports.
Okay.
But this actually led to a boom in coca production.
Wait, coca, as in the raw material for cocaine?
The one and only.
That's unexpected. How did that happen?
It's a classic example of unintended consequences.
Right.
So U.S. agricultural subsidies were undercutting Bolivian farmers.
Making it harder for them to compete.
Exactly. And as a result, many farmers turned to coca production.
Because it was more profitable.
Right. And less susceptible to U.S. competition.
So the policies that were supposed to promote economic stability ended up fueling the drug trade.
It's kind of mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is. And it makes you wonder, are we really fighting a war on drugs when our own policies are contributing to the problem?
That's a question Chomsky raises, and it's a good one.
This deep dive is really making me question everything I thought I knew about the world.
That's the power of critical thinking.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's important to look beyond the surface and ask those tough questions.
No pain, no gain. Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm ready for the next challenge. What else have you got for me?
Well, let's talk about Somalia.
Somalia?
Yeah, and the U.S. intervention there back in the early 1990s.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
It was a big deal.
It was. I'm curious to hear what Chomsky has to say about it.
Well, you know he's always been a critic of U.S. foreign policy.
That's true. So what's his take on this one?
He views the intervention through a very critical lens.
Okay.
He suggests that it was less about genuine humanitarian concern.
For the Somali people who were suffering from that terrible famine.
Right. He thinks it was more about the Pentagon needing a public relations boost.
So they were using the suffering of these people to justify their own existence.
That's his argument.
It's pretty cynical.
It is. But he points to the timing of the intervention.
Okay.
Which happened after the worst of the famine had already passed. And also the way the Pentagon coordinated with the media.
To control the narrative.
Exactly.
It's like they were manufacturing a humanitarian crisis to justify their actions.
That's a bold claim.
It is, but it makes you think.
It does.
This actually reminds me of something we were talking about earlier.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
This idea that the Pentagon system is becoming less and less viable.
Right. Especially after the Cold War ended.
Yeah, it seems like they needed to find new ways to justify their existence.
And their budget.
Exactly.
And what better way to do that than through a highly publicized humanitarian intervention?
Even if the motivations aren't entirely pure.
Something to think about.
It is. It's a lot to process.
It is.
But this deep dive is really opening my eyes to how these things are all connected.
That's the point.
The global economy, politics, power dynamics.
It's all intertwined.
It is. It's a lot more complex than I ever realized.
It is. But that's why it's so important to keep asking questions and keep digging deeper.
I agree. All right, so what else is on the agenda for this deep dive? I'm ready for more.
Well, before we move on, I think it's important to acknowledge something that's been happening all around us.
Okay.
This resurgence of violence and tribalism.
Oh, yeah. That's hard to ignore.
It is. It seems like everywhere you look, there's conflict and division.
From Los Angeles to the Balkans, Kashmir to the Caucasus.
It's really alarming.
It is.
Yeah.
What does Chomsky have to say about all this?
Well, he's not denying that these problems are real.
Of course not.
But he argues that while violence and tribalism have always existed,
Right.
certain factors are making them worse in our current context.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to a lot of instability in Eastern Europe.
Power vacuums and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, in the West, you've got economic insecurity.
Yeah. A lot of people are struggling.
And that breeds fear.
Which makes people more susceptible to scapegoating and division.
Right. And often those in power exploit those anxieties.
To maintain their control.
Exactly. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy.
It's easier to rule when people are fighting among themselves.
That's the idea. And Chomsky also emphasizes how much European colonialism has contributed to these divisions.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is, but it's important to acknowledge the lasting impact of those colonial policies.
The exploitation, the pitting of groups against each other.
Exactly.
So it's like we're still dealing with the aftershocks centuries later.
We are, and he uses some really powerful examples, like the British in Ireland. And the British in India.
Right, to show how these colonial powers deliberately sowed discord among different groups.
Just to maintain their control.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
It is. But it's important to understand how these historical forces continue to shape the world today.
I agree. Okay, so before we wrap things up here, I want to bring up one more topic that Chomsky keeps coming back to. The issue of class.
Ah, yes, the unmentionable 5-letter word.
Exactly. But why is it so taboo? Especially in a country like the United States.
That's interesting, isn't it?
It is. You'd think in a society that prides itself on equality.
Right.
We'd be more open to talking about these things.
You would think. But Chomsky points out this really interesting contrast between how we talk about race and how we talk about class.
So racism is something we're willing to discuss openly.
Yeah, there are all these conversations and debates happening all the time.
Right, but class is this kind of elephant in the room.
Exactly. And he uses this striking example from public health research to illustrate his point.
Okay, I'm listening.
So this researcher named Vicente Navarro, he did a study that showed a really strong correlation between class and health outcomes.
So basically he found that a lot of the racial disparities in health were actually driven by socioeconomic factors.
Exactly. It wasn't just about race. It was about poverty, lack of access to health care.
All those things that are tied to class.
Right. But guess what happened when he tried to publish his findings in U.S. medical journals?
They rejected him.
They did.
Wow. So it's like there's this unspoken rule that we're not allowed to talk about class.
Even when the evidence is staring us right in the face.
That's crazy.
It is. And this taboo surrounding class isn't just limited to academia either.
Oh, I bet it shows up everywhere.
It does. It permeates our language, our media, our political discourse.
So we hear a lot about entrepreneurs and job creators. And the middle class.
Right.
But we don't really talk about the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
Or the shrinking middle class.
Or the systems that are creating these inequalities.
Exactly.
It's like we're living in a society where class is the elephant in the room.
And everyone's pretending it's not there.
It's pretty messed up when you think about it.
It is. But the first step towards change is awareness.
Right. We can't fix a problem if we don't acknowledge that it exists. Well, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
I'm glad you think so.
It's a lot to digest, but it's definitely making me rethink some of my assumptions about the world.
That's what we're here for.
To challenge ourselves and to learn from each other.
Exactly. Welcome back. It's been great digging into these complex issues with you.
Yeah, this is some heavy stuff, but it's so important to understand.
Absolutely. And before we jump into Chomsky's concept of manufactured consent, I want to pick up on something we touched on earlier.
Okay.
This idea that language is often used to kind of shape our understanding of the world.
Especially when it comes to economics.
Exactly. Like there are all these words and phrases that we hear over and over again.
And we start to accept them as truth without really questioning them.
It's like a magic trick almost.
Right. We get so caught up in the shiny language that we miss what's really going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. And one of the biggest illusions out there, I think, is this notion of a level playing field.
Ah, yes, the classic American dream.
Exactly. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work hard and you'll succeed.
Everyone has an equal chance.
Right. But Chomsky's point is that this narrative ignores all of the structural barriers.
That prevents true equality of opportunity.
Exactly. Things like inherited wealth. Unequal access to quality education. The concentration of power and resources in the hands of a select few.
So it's not just about individual effort.
No, not at all.
the game itself might be rigged.
In a lot of ways it is. And this brings us back to those trade agreements we were talking about.
NAFTA and GATT.
Yep, the ones that are supposed to be all about free trade and competitiveness.
Right. But we were just saying how those terms can be kind of misleading.
They can. And Chomsky argues that what these agreements often lead to is a race to the bottom.
A race to the bottom. What does that look like in practice?
Basically, it means that corporations, in their pursuit of maximum profits, will seek out the places with the lowest labor costs, the weakest environmental regulations, the fewest worker protections.
So it's this downward spiral where everyone loses.
Except for those at the very top.
Right. The ones who are calling the shots.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Chomsky's point is that even those wealthy individuals, even those corporations, they can ultimately be harmed by this race to the bottom.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, remember we were talking about the decline of public infrastructure.
Yeah, the roads, the bridges, the schools, all that.
Exactly. When you gut funding for those things, it eventually comes back to bite everyone.
Because you need a functioning society for businesses to thrive.
Precisely. You need educated workers. You need reliable transportation.
Yeah.
You need a healthy population.
Like cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah, you might get some short-term gains.
But in the long run, everyone suffers.
Exactly. And this leads to a really important question. If these systems are, as Chomsky suggests, skewed in favor of the powerful, what can we do to change them?
That is the million-dollar question.
It is, and Chomsky doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
Of course not.
But he does emphasize the crucial role of challenging those dominant narratives.
The stories we tell ourselves about how the world works.
Exactly. He encourages us to be skeptical, to question assumptions.
To look beyond the surface.
Right, and to understand the historical forces that have shaped our current predicament.
So it's about becoming more aware.
Yes, more aware of how language and ideology are being used.
They could control us.
To shape our perceptions and to limit our imaginations.
It sounds kind of scary when you put it that way.
It can be, but it's also empowering.
How so?
Because knowledge is power.
Right.
And the more we understand how these systems work, the more we can start to resist them.
Okay, I like that. So what can we do as individuals?
Well, Chomsky really believes in the power of collective action.
People coming together to demand change.
Exactly. He argues that even in the face of these huge obstacles, individuals working together can create meaningful change.
There's power in numbers.
Absolutely. Think about movements like the civil rights movement or the labor movement. Those were ordinary people coming together.
Yeah, to demand a better world.
And they didn't achieve victory overnight.
Of course not.
They faced huge challenges, setbacks, internal divisions.
But they persisted.
They did, and they ultimately made a profound difference.
So if you're feeling overwhelmed by the scale of these problems, remember that you're not alone.
You're not. And even small acts of resistance, when multiplied by many,
can contribute to a larger movement.
Exactly. So don't underestimate your own power to make a difference.
That's actually really encouraging.
Good. I'm glad. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to introduce you to one of the most thought-provoking ideas from Chomsky's work.
I'm ready. Lay it on me.
The manufacture of consent.
The manufacture of consent. Sounds a little Orwellian, but I'm intrigued.
It is a bit Orwellian, but it's a really powerful way of understanding how power operates in modern democracies.
So not through force or coercion?
Not directly, no.
But through something more subtle.
Exactly, through these more subtle forms of control and manipulation.
So it's about shaping people's beliefs and perceptions.
Precisely. Think about the constant bombardment of advertising, the carefully crafted narratives in the news, the subtle biases in our education systems.
So it's like this constant messaging that we're exposed to.
It is, and it's all designed to create a sense of consensus.
To make people think that what's good for those in power is also good for them.
Exactly, even when that might not be the case.
It's like kind of like mind control, but it's so pervasive that we don't even realize it's happening.
That's the insidious part, and it's not just limited to traditional media either.
Oh, I bet it's happening everywhere.
It is. It's happening in our workplaces, in our social circles, even within ourselves as we internalize these dominant narratives.
So it's like this constant process of shaping our perceptions, normalizing inequality, and discouraging critical thinking.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these dynamics. The more we can recognize how our thoughts and beliefs are being influenced, the more we can start to resist those influences and think for ourselves.
So how do we do that? How do we become more critical consumers of information?
That's a great question. And one of the most important things is to diversify your sources of information.
So don't just rely on one news outlet or one social media feed.
Exactly. Seek out alternative perspectives, especially those that challenge your existing beliefs.
Get out of our echo chambers.
Exactly. And when you are consuming information, don't just passively absorb it.
Okay.
Ask yourself who's presenting this information. What are their biases? What might be missing from this story?
So it's about being an active participant.
Yes. Be engaged. Be critical. Don't just accept everything at face value.
That makes sense.
And remember, you're not alone in this. There are lots of people out there who are working to expose these systems of manipulation.
To create a more transparent and just world.
Exactly.
Well, this conversation is definitely making me think about how I consume information.
Good, that's the goal.
And how susceptible I might be to these manufactured narratives.
We all are, to some extent.
It's kind of unsettling, to be honest.
It can be, but it's also empowering.
How so?
Because once you start to see these patterns, you can't unsee them.
That's true.
And that awareness gives you the power to make more informed choices.
I like that. So speaking of informed choices,
yes,
let's talk about Chomsky's analysis of that U.S. intervention in Somalia.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it seems like a prime example of how manufactured consent can be used to shape public opinion.
Right, to justify military action.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Chomsky's argument is that this intervention, which was portrayed as this humanitarian mission,
right, to alleviate the famine,
was actually motivated by something else entirely?
He believes so.
The Pentagon's desire to justify its own existence.
And its budget.
Right, because the Cold War was over. And they needed a new enemy.
Or at least a new reason to exist.
Exactly. So they used the suffering of the Somali people.
It's a harsh accusation.
It is. But it's hard to ignore the evidence that Chomsky presents.
Like what?
Well, the timing of the intervention, for one thing.
Right. It happened after the worst of the famine had already passed.
Exactly. And then there's the way the Pentagon worked with the media.
To control the story.
To create this narrative of American heroism.
It's like they were making a Hollywood movie.
With the U.S. as the savior.
Yeah. But the reality on the ground might have been very different.
It usually is. And this brings us back to that whole idea of manufactured consent.
Right. We have to be careful about accepting these prepackaged narratives.
Without questioning them.
Exactly. We need to dig deeper. Consider alternative perspectives.
Be critical thinkers.
Exactly.
So in the case of Somalia, what were some of the perspectives that were missing from that mainstream narrative?
Well, one crucial perspective that was largely absent was the voice of the Somali people themselves.
Oh, yeah.
What were their needs?
What do they want?
Exactly what were their solutions?
Were they even consulted?
That's a good question, and it's one that Chomsky raises.
Because this intervention was supposedly being done in their name.
Right, but it often happens that way.
That the people who are supposedly being helped don't even get a say in the matter.
Their agency is completely erased.
And this all ties back to Chomsky's critique of power.
It does. It's not just about physical force or economic domination.
Okay.
It's about controlling the narrative, shaping the story, silencing dissenting voices.
So it's a form of cultural and ideological control.
Exactly. And it can be just as effective as military might or economic sanctions.
Maybe even more so because it's less visible.
Exactly. It's more insidious because it's harder to pinpoint.
Wow, this is all pretty heavy stuff.
It is, but it's important to talk about these things.
I agree. It's the first step towards change.
Awareness is key.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to resist these systems of control?
That's the big question, and it's one that we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, looking forward to it.
But for now, I want to leave you, the listener, with a challenge.
Okay, I'm ready. Challenge accepted.
Pay attention to the language being used around you.
Okay.
Notice those subtle biases in the news, in advertising and political discourse.
Right.
Ask yourself who benefits from these narratives.
Advice.
And most importantly, don't be afraid to speak up.
To challenge those narratives when you see injustice or inequality.
Exactly. It's about becoming more conscious, more engaged citizens.
And recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Welcome back to the show. You know, it's really striking.
It is.
How all these different pieces that we've been talking about, you know, from trade agreements to the Pentagon's role to even just like the language we use.
Yeah.
It all ties back to these underlying power dynamics.
It does.
And how those dynamics are shaping our world.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, right?
about what Chomsky has to say about the resurgence of violence and tribalism.
Yeah.
I kind of touched on it earlier.
Right.
But I feel like it's such a big topic.
It is.
And it's especially relevant given everything that's happening in the world today.
Absolutely. And it's something that Chomsky has written a lot about.
So what's his take? Like, what's driving all of this conflict and division?
Well, he makes this really important point that while these conflicts often appear to be rooted in, ancient hatreds or cultural differences,
right,
he argues that they're often exacerbated by these underlying economic and political factors.
So it's not just about, like, age-old grudges or clashing civilizations.
Right. It's more complicated than that.
There's more to the story.
Exactly. And he points to a few specific things that are contributing to this.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, the collapse of the Soviet Union created this power vacuum.
Right, in a lot of parts of the world.
Leading to instability and conflict.
So it's like all those old rivalries and tensions, they're able to resurface.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, in the West, you've got this rise of economic insecurity.
Right. A lot of people are struggling.
And that breeds fear.
Which can make people more susceptible to scapegoating and division.
Exactly. And often those in power exploit those anxieties and divisions.
Stay in power.
Exactly. It's that classic divide and conquer strategy.
Keep the people fighting amongst themselves.
And they won't notice who's really pulling the strings.
Right. And Chomsky also talks a lot about how European colonialism has contributed to these divisions.
That's a huge factor.
It is. And it's not something that we always talk about.
No, but it's really important to acknowledge.
Yeah, like that legacy of exploitation, the pitting of groups against each other.
The divide and rule tactics.
Exactly. It's like we're still dealing with the aftershocks.
We are. And Chomsky uses some really compelling examples to illustrate this. Well, he talks about the British in Ireland.
Okay, yeah.
And the British in India.
Right, to show how these colonial powers deliberately sowed discord among different groups.
Just to maintain their control.
It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is, and it reminds us that we can't really understand the present without grappling with the past.
I agree. Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive into Chomsky's work, I want to circle back to something that we've been touching on throughout our conversation.
What's that?
The issue of class.
Ah, yes. The unmentionable 5-letter word.
Exactly. But why is it so taboo? Especially in the United States.
It's strange, isn't it?
It is. You'd think in a society that prides itself on equality and opportunity, we'd be more open to having these conversations.
You would think, but Chomsky makes this really interesting contrast.
Okay.
Between how we talk about race and how we talk about class.
So racism is something that we're willing to discuss openly.
Yeah, there are all these conversations and debates happening all the time.
But class is this, like, elephant in the room.
Right. It's something that people are uncomfortable talking about.
And Chomsky uses this really striking example from public health research to illustrate this point.
Okay.
So there's this researcher named Vicente Navarro, and he did this study that showed a strong correlation between class and health outcomes.
So basically he's saying that a lot of the racial disparities in health are actually driven by socioeconomic factors.
Exactly. So it's not just about race. It's about poverty, lack of access to health care.
All those things that are tied to class.
Right. But guess what happened when he tried to publish his findings in U.S. medical journals?
Yeah, they rejected it.
They did?
Yeah, they didn't want to touch it.
Wow. So it's like there's this unspoken rule that we're not supposed to talk about class.
Even when the evidence suggests that it's a major factor.
That's incredible.
It is. And this taboo surrounding class isn't just limited to academia either.
Oh, no, I'm sure it pops up everywhere.
It does. It extends to our language, our media, our political discourse.
So we hear a lot about entrepreneurs and job creators.
Right. All these positive sounding terms.
And the middle class.
Yeah. But we don't really talk about the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
Or the shrinking middle class.
Or the systems that are creating these inequalities in the first place.
Exactly. It's like we're living in a society where class is this elephant in the room.
That everyone's pretending isn't there.
And it's preventing us from having these really important conversations.
It is, and it's making it harder to find solutions.
Right. Like, how can we address inequality if we're not willing to talk about its root causes?
Exactly. It's like trying to solve a math problem without knowing the formula.
So if Chomsky's right, and these systems are really rigged,
Mm-hmm.
in favor of the powerful counts, what can we do to create a more just and equitable world?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. Does he offer any solutions?
Well, he doesn't have this simple roadmap or a one-size-fits-all solution, but he does emphasize the importance of critical thinking.
Okay.
Questioning assumptions, challenging the status quo.
So we can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix things.
No, we all have a role to play.
We have to take action ourselves.
Exactly, and that action can take many forms.
Like what?
Well, it could be educating ourselves about these issues, supporting organizations that are fighting for social and economic justice, engaging in meaningful conversations.
Yeah, with our families and community.
Exactly, and even just making more conscious choices in our daily lives.
So it's about being more aware and more intentional.
Absolutely, and remember, every social movement, every revolution started with individuals.
Individuals who dared to imagine something different.
Exactly, who dared to question the way things were.
And to fight for a better world.
That's what it's all about.
Wow, well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
I'm glad you found it helpful.
I have. And I think the key takeaway for me is this.
Okay.
The global economy is complex.
It is.
And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the challenges we're facing.
It is.
But we can't afford to be passive observers.
No, we can't.
We need to be informed. We need to be engaged.
Yes.
And we need to be willing to challenge those systems.
To speak truth to power.
Exactly. Those systems that are perpetuating inequality and injustice.
That's how we create a better world.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for that better world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.